Good morning. Thank you everyone for coming, and also for those who are online for joining us online as well. My name is Carolyn Nguyen. I'm a policy person here at Microsoft. And first of all, I'd like to thank our illustrious panelists and keynote speaker for joining us here today for this conversation. I'd also like to thank ISOC DC for organizing this series with us. I'd also like to thank Pepper. He's not in the room right now, but without Pepper, nothing really works. So I just want to make sure that we thank him and noted his, and also all of you for showing up here, very early this morning for this, sort of part 2 of our Microsoft and ISOC DC series on is the Internet fragmenting. The reason David and I sat down and started this is really, we want to explore the different ways in which the internet can fragment. And our aim and our objective is really to increase awareness of this issue within the internet community, and in particular, the various nuances and dimensions in terms of technical, economic, and political dimensions. And our idea is hopefully this will increase awareness, and that will lead to more informed policy development, as well as hopefully also encourage more dialogues and conversations amongst all the different stakeholders on this issue. In today's event, we've chosen the technical lens. In other words, we're going to be looking at this from 3 angles: how technology choices may inadvertently fragment the internet, how technologies are being deployed to intentionally fragment the internet, and what role does technology play in enforcing and realizing a policy. We have an illustrious panel of technical and policy experts. Some speak technology, some speak policy, most speak both. And that's really, really unique because we really strongly believe that such a dialogue is really, really critical as the internet becomes the underlying foundation for just about everything that we do in life. They all have a long history and practical experience in the design, development, and operations of the internet and its policies to really help us navigate this discussion. So I really look forward to an interesting morning and turn it over to David for a few comments.
Thank you. Thank you, Carolyn. My name is David Viorst. I'm the Executive Director of the Washington, D.C. chapter of the Internet Society, and I'm very proud to have helped to organize this series and this event. I'd like to echo all of Carolyn's thanks and thank everybody who worked so hard to make today possible. I'd especially like to thank Microsoft for their vision and support, and particularly Carolyn Nguyen and Stephanie Goldberg at Microsoft, as well as our amazing panel. The internet has been an unparalleled driver of economic growth, and it is perhaps the greatest amplifier of human endeavor yet. Thus, the question of whether the internet is fragmenting should be of the utmost importance to us. This is the second event in our 4-part series. During our first event, our distinguished keynote and panel examined different perspectives on internet fragmentation and posited methods to frame and address the phenomenon. Upcoming events will cover the commercial and political dimensions of internet fragmentation in more detail. Today, we examine the technical aspects of internet fragmentation, and we are honored and quite fortunate to have a keynote speaker so ideally suited to discuss this. David Farber is a distinguished career professor of computer science and public policy at the School of Computer Science at Carnegie Mellon University and an inductee into the Internet Hall of Fame. His achievements are far too long to list and too important to take for granted. Professor Farber has been a prominent defender of the internet and has been involved in both critical policy and technology deliberations, including his role as chief technologist for the FCC, mentor to many of the internet's founding pioneers, and as an advisor to companies and governments. His IP email list is a key forum where both the immediate issues and long-term consequences of the internet are first discussed in public. In fact, I had to trade him pictures from Istanbul to get added to the list myself. A staunch promoter of personal freedoms, he is a longtime trustee of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and he serves on the advisory board of the Electronic Privacy Information Center. He is a member of the Markle Task Force on National Security in the Information Age as well. So without further ado, it is my great pleasure to present our keynote, David Farber.
Am I getting through? Okay. I'm going to try to hold these introductory. A little late started, and the panel is probably the most interesting part of it, but I'd like to make some observations. I've been around the internet for a long, long time. As mentioned, some of my students, graduate students, were among the pioneers of the internet, like John Postel, Paul Mark-Petras, and many others. So I've watched it develop, I watched it mature, and I watched networks get deployed. I was involved, as many others, in the deployment of networks outside of the initial ARPANET, CSNet, BitNet. And the drive for that was to connect together, largely initially academics, computer scientists around the world who wanted to be able to work together. Later on, physicists, chemists, and in general academics. So in a open, borderless fashion. As it went commercial, and there's a long, interesting story of how it went commercial, which I won't talk about here, that was still a driving force. Wide distribution, a borderless world. Well, things happened, big surprise, for a whole host of reasons. I'd like to just talk about some of those and maybe challenge the field a little bit. Early on, the internet or networks were really a research problem. And as I keep pointing out to people, when it was being developed, the last issue anybody ever worried about was security issues. And we were maybe 100 people trying to get the damn thing working, and they were friends. And friends don't worry about that. So in fact, the whole set of approaches were taken without worrying about issues such as security and privacy and issues like that. And that's colored the development of the worldwide internet and caused both some advantages and some major disadvantages. What you're seeing now, and you know, there's always this treacherous mix between policy and technology, and it's never clear which causes which. In Washington, my experience over the years has been that there's a terrible disconnect between people who deal with policy, especially governments, and technologists that are driving the underpinnings that that policy has to be applied to. We can see that endlessly in the internet days. As the net became more and more important to the commercial life of countries and industries, things appeared which, in hindsight, we should have predicted, but never quite got around to doing. And that's things like intellectual property protection, the privacy issues of nation states and individuals. And this has constantly been a motivation and a forcing function that gets you in positions where you really want to keep parts of the net isolated from other parts of the net when you want to fragment it. The first one I remember on that was actually a Canadian insurance company who wanted to be bought by an American insurance company. And one of the major benefits they'd have, of course, is they could move all the data to one large computing center in Texas. And the Canadian government said, under no conditions will you take data about our citizens and put it in a place where it's subject to American law. And that's still a major problem. Now, is that a technology issue or is it strictly a policy issue? Well, it's in a sense both, because we understand technology which could give us that differentiation, no matter where things are. But in fact, that's still a research problem. It's never been really deployed. I think in the future, you're going to see a lot more fragmentation. I just want to maybe raise the issues of why that's going to happen. I said one of them is that the whole structure of the protocol structure of the net and the machines we run on and the software we run basically is not very robust. I think that's a polite way of putting it. Just watch the interarrival rate of fixes to things like Apple's OS X. They arrive so fast it's hard to keep up with the updates. That, again, that's indicative of major problems in the infrastructure. I believe that security is going to be one of the forcing functions that will keep things from being a flat surface. Countries are not going to want to connect unless they can have some assurance that they will not be subject to external attack or other things which will compromise their world. We see that constantly. China is a good example of that for both technical and political reasons. Now, putting on a technical hat for a minute, repeating in a second a talk I gave out at Stanford in December, we understand how to solve all these problems. There's no real technical unknowns in coming up with a system that could be incredibly more secure than what we have now, incredibly more capable of separating data. There's a big problem of how to actually make that happen, and there's a worse problem of what do you do with the millions and millions of computers and people out there who will never manage to transition to that. And that, I think, is both a technical issue, how to do it, and the will to do it, and a real policy issue and economic issue of how do you force that. Unless we do, I think we're going to see more and more fragmentation. We're going to see more and more people saying that, well, if you want to talk to my country, you better use my encryption, which already you see. You're going to see more and more, I want all of the data about my citizens kept within my country, which TPP seems to have in the back of their mind. And that will cause an effective fragmentation. So, as a challenge to everybody, what are we going to do about it? Is this an unsolvable problem? I don't think it's unsolvable technically. It may be unsolvable in a political and policy perspective. That's a good stuff.
Thank you, Dave. On that note, I will challenge the panelists to answer Dave's questions. How do we solve this? But thank you very much for your very thoughtful insights. I will do a very quick introduction of the panelists, so you know who they are. You have their detailed bios. So what I'll do is really just introduce them and their title. Each of their bios will take hours to go into. So the first is Dr. Milton Mueller, who is author of multiple authoritative books on internet governance and currently the professor of public policy at the Georgia Institute of Technology School of Public Policy. Next to Milton is Suzanne Woolf, who is an internet infrastructure consultant specializing in internet infrastructure operations and policy, so she can speak authoritatively in terms of the technologies that are necessary in order to maintain an interoperable and global internet and the tensions that she would have to deal with. She is a member of the Internet Architecture Board and Liaison to ICANN Board of Directors for the Root Server System Advisory Committee, and speaks both technology and policy. Next to Suzanne is Dr. Eric Berger, who's currently a research professor of computer science and director of the Security and Software Engineering Research Center at Georgetown University. Dr. Berger has a long list of technology, RFCs that he's done, entrepreneur. He's a serial entrepreneur and still consults for industry on various issues, in particular related to security, the very issue that Dr. Farber has pointed out. And then we have Micaela Klein, who's an internet policy advisor at the U.S. Department of State. Micaela is really one of the main force behind formulating, coordinating, and advancing U.S. policies in policy meetings around the world. So she'll be speaking to us today about the policy impact of many of the technologies that we are discussing here in terms of how is that leveraged by governments and policies that governments are introducing around the world. And not lastly, but joining us remotely from California, where it is now still only 5:49 a.m., is Eliot Lear. who's the principal engineer at Cisco System, but also known as the corporate irritant. From the perspective of, he speaks authoritatively on many, many technology issues from both practical experience, extreme knowledge, and also participation at the ITU. So I'd like to welcome everyone. What I'll do is let's like to ask each of our panelists a question and then really turn it over to the audience as well as online. So Milton, you are writing a book on this very topic of fragmentation. Can you help us? Dave defined fragmentation and also the pressures on fragmentation, but Dave defined it as two parts of the internet isolated. Can you help us with how you define fragmentation, and in particular, because this is a technical lens, what are some examples of technologies being deployed in the internet that are fragmenting it, and are there examples of fragmentation that are desirable?
Sure. So I just want to begin by saying I don't think the internet is in danger of a major technical fragmentation. Fragmentation is a very strong word, all right? You think of, you break a glass and it busts up into fragments and the pieces are disconnected. That's the typical connotation of fragmentation. That's not happening. That's not what's happening to the internet. So let's back up a bit and actually talk about what holds it together. The benefits, the economic and technical benefits of compatibility is what's known as the network externality in economics, or network benefits. And this means that if you converge on a common compatible protocol, you get added value, okay? And in economics, this is called more technically demand-side economies of scope. Maybe we don't need to go into that. But the idea is basically that a system becomes more valuable if more people converge on the same compatible system. And there's a very well-known process through which this happens. There's this startup problem where the network is not valuable because no one is on it. And then you get over that hump and you get what you call bandwagon effects, where everybody says, wow, this is really, everybody's joining this, let's get onto it. And then you have convergence on a single system, and then you have inertia. Everybody is so locked into this system because of the compatibility that it's hard to get out of it, even when maybe you should. So the internet is well established. There's a massive inertia holding people onto it, and it's a very powerful inertia. It's so strong that we can't get people to migrate to IPv6 because IPv4 is so inertial, so well established. So I think when most people talk about so-called fragmentation, they're actually talking not about a technical phenomenon, but a political and legal phenomenon, which I call alignment. And that's where governments try to bring internet-based communications under their territorial control, because there's misalignment now between the global internet and global compatibility and the political institutions that we have to try to control things. So people often call this fragmentation, but it doesn't really fragment the internet technically. Let's take data localization as an example. The data is there, it's connected globally, but you say it has to be in this jurisdiction. And then you're going to try to figure out whether it's moving in or out of that jurisdiction, so that you have a surveillance problem as well. But it's not like you're disconnecting, when Brazil passes a data localization law, it's not like they're seceding from the internet and cutting themselves off. Now, alignment, what it does is it puts data under the jurisdiction of a territorial government. And by doing so, it fragments the service, let's say, of a cloud provider. And it destroys incredible technical and economic efficiencies that would be realizable if you didn't do that. But I also would not define as fragmentation when somebody sets up a private network and says, nobody can access this. I mean, we want banks to do that, right? We want our military to do that. And indeed, the internet is really a system of independent networks that are interconnected through a compatible protocol. And every one of those individual networks has a right to decide, what am I going to let in and what am I going to let out? And that's the internet. So the problem is not really a breakdown of global compatibility. more this misalignment between political control and technical capabilities. And I think the danger is the unit deciding things, what goes in and out, is not the autonomous system, not the people running the networks, which it should be. It's these governments who want to, fragment. They want to make the map of the internet match the map of the political world. And I think that's the danger.
So that was partly your answer to Dave's question about what can be done, in terms of this misalignment. We'll come back to that at the end to say, okay, so how do we achieve that, understanding? And Micaela, I'll ask you to address some of that a little bit later on as well, this political misalignment with the technology. Eliot, I'll turn to you now. So given what Milton has said, is the internet really currently open? I mean, we talk about the open internet a lot, but I'd be interested in your perspective. And also, I'd like to, from a technology perspective, looking backwards, what are some of the technologies that are being deployed that can cause fragmentation? And also, because of some of the work that you're doing at the ITU, also looking forward, what are some of the internet protocol technologies under discussion that may lead to technical fragmentation? I should say, using the terminology that Milton has introduced, it's really not the technology, but it's really how can these technologies be used to fragment the internet politically?
Thank you very much, Ms. Carolyn, for the question. Let's say, first of all, looking backwards, I want to say that Dave can look a lot far backwards than I can. And, when I look backwards and see, based on what Milton and Dave have said, it wasn't always the case that there was one layer 3 protocol, IP. There was DECnet, there was an IBM protocol, there was AppleTalk, and there was this convergence. And Milton's exactly correct that the internet is a network of networks. And so long as we have this stable layer 3, those who wish to connect at layer 3 largely can, with a couple of major exceptions. So let me talk about a couple of them. One of the big challenges we have right now, I think, is in the home. It's not really possible for people in the home to actually run, to actually get public IP address space for IPv4. It's just not enough of it. Everybody in the home uses private addresses, which aren't really, you can use them to get services to yourself, but it's very difficult to actually offer a service to others. And the vision of IP is that anybody should be able to offer any service to anybody. And the actual limitations in terms of the amount of address space that we have on IPv4 are causing at least one form of fragmentation, which is that home users cannot actually offer services to one another or to other companies or businesses or governments. So we have certain technical limitations because of that. And that's why IPv6, the transition to IPv6 to me is very important. But Milton's exactly correct, that once you have this network effect, you have layer 3 in place. Absent some very stark regulation, it's very hard to move out from one IP to another. And we're seeing that the transition to IPv6 is happening, but it is happening at a rate that I'm sure nobody would have liked. I'm sure we would have all liked it done by now. And so this leads to a couple of other areas of fragmentation that can happen, and most of it is at layer 3, just to me. Now, there's higher layer fragmentation too, but the higher layer fragmentation can get solved more easily by the market most of the time. We have one email. How you access the web, there is one set of web protocols that everybody uses. But there are a couple of exceptions. A good exception is instant messaging. There are numerous instant messaging standards. How we communicate with one another means that we have to have multiple programs on our iPhones or our Android systems to communicate, and then it's hard to aggregate that information as a user. And so that's a counterexample. But what many people do is they'll use a program that does this aggregation for them. So again, the market solves it. So what causes the fragmentation? Indeed, it can be government. As Milton was saying, if one government mandated the use of a particular encryption and another government mandated the use of another encryption of their residents, then the two groups of people could not communicate. And we've seen attempts at that in the past. Another case is if one government mandates a particular routing paradigm, where others are mandating it or have come to conclusion on a different routing paradigm. We saw a little of this friction between the various forces within the ITU and the IETF play out in previous years, back in the 2010, 2012 period of time. So those are just some examples, and with that, I'll pause.
Great, thank you, Eliot. We'll come back to the routing because you brought up routing. Dave has brought up data localization, and I think there's a theme emerging here from the different speakers. Suzanne, I'll turn to you for the next question. Really, I'm fascinated from an operational perspective for a global internet. How do you address the tension between needing to maintain a globally interoperable internet, but also still enable local control? If you can help us a little bit with the tension there and how that balance is addressed.
Well, the challenge there's a whole bunch of sort of overlapping issues there, and I think it goes very much to what we've already said here, particularly to complement something that Milton was saying and to pick up on Dr. Farber's point about security. Even before we're talking about policy and as an engine of fragmentation or economics, we're sort of asking the question sort of assumes a basic level of interoperability in the infrastructure. Assumes, for instance, that a wide variety of data localization policies are possible because the underlying connectivity is there. And it turns out that there's actually quite a few challenges even to maintaining that. As the internet gets larger, as more people want to connect and do more things, these are good problems to have, but one of the basic challenges, I think, to interoperability is the internet and what people want to do with it do not stand still. So even making sure that we're keeping up is a constant challenge. The technology folks speak often of managing change at internet scale and internet speed. And there's a whole set of challenges there before you even get into defining what your policies are and how you want to interoperate with others. There's a set of challenges that it's very difficult to deploy new technologies. For instance, we did a lot of work in evolving the DNS protocol standards to do a better job of protecting people's concerns about privacy for those who wanted to implement a wider variety of policies there. And it turns out to be extremely difficult to get that deployed because, you know, all of the economic and social and political reasons why that's difficult. The other thing is that there are some very good reasons within particular networks and particular operational paradigms for deploying technology that inadvertently creates new challenges for the infrastructure, for that layer of commonality. For instance, many carriers, for many reasons, good reasons having to do with user experience and access and so on, are deploying devices in their networks that promote certain forms of content delivery and optimization of the experience, but mostly inadvertently shut off other possible ways of interoperating and other possible sets of policies for content. So how you maintain, to me, the underlying problem is maintaining interoperability, is maintaining the flexibility that people can build whatever policies they need on top of the infrastructure. And there are many pieces of answers for that, but as a starting point, as a technologist in this area, I'm a big fan of open standards, because that's how you maintain, that's how the people that want to maintain interoperability talk to each other about how to do that in the evolving internet. The other thing that I think has been instrumental in maintaining transparency of operational paradigms and transparency among operators and so on is open source. Because when it comes down to making sure that people can connect with each other, can make these decisions about what the policies are for interconnection, they need as much flexibility as we as technologists can give them, and as much transparency into how the infrastructure works so they can decide where to participate, and frankly, sometimes where not to. So I think the answers to those questions go in that direction, and but it's a very, as Dr. Farber said, it's very much a live area of discussion and experiment and evolution.
Lots of tensions there. So we, building up on the comments from the various different panelists, we talk a lot about the misalignment and also the tensions in terms of being able to connect, you know, when people want to and not. Eric, what, can you discuss some examples of how governments are making use of technology, you know, kind of building on the tension that Suzanne was talking about, to protect the networks inside their borders? We already talk about, you know, encryption, data localization, DNS filtering to a certain extent. And what are some of the unintended consequences?
Sure. So, and part of this is, again, back to that question of what do we mean by fragmentation? At the lowest level, as Eliot pointed out, you know, if you choose to go back to DECnet or Apple Talk, well, yeah, that's going to be different internets. I don't think people are thinking about that so much as thinking of, well, what happens when a country cuts their citizens off of the internet? And one of the important things to consider is the technology doesn't know good from evil. Most of you here, I see you're on your Blackberries, or, oh, Mike, I love your Treo. You know, we use email. And what would you think of an email provider that did not do spam filtering? You'd be going, oh, you know, these guys are awful. You know, I've got this new service and I get all this spam in my, I'm going to go to someone who provides spam filtering. It's something you want. Well, there are certain countries that say we are going to protect our citizens from malware. We want to ensure that, you know, all the providers provide spam filtering. And as well, we want to make sure that they're protected from evil thoughts, because evil thoughts can harm our citizenry, and it's our job to protect our citizenry. So we wouldn't want them to know about things like democracy movements within their country, or people who are taking stands against the government. You know, looking at traffic blocking, if you are noticing that there's a source of an attack on your network, very easy, and it's a thing that, again, they're multi-billion-dollar businesses over this IP address is bad. At the other side of that IP address is a command and control server that's sucking stuff out of your network, or there's stuff in your network that's going out to this address that's not yours. And the rational thing to do is to block that. In fact, this was probably a bit of the misunderstood kill switch. If our nation is under attack from what looks like a whole bunch of countries around the world, actually a botnet, we would be demanding, please turn that off while we figure out what to do and figure out how to remediate that. That is a rational, sensible thing to do. And yet, you know, we talk about the Great Firewall of China, where they're protecting themselves from malware and bad stuff coming in from outside the country. And again, you could argue they're protecting their citizens from evil thoughts. And the last bit of technology that we see being deployed is the bad guys figure out, oh, well, they're going to filter out the spam. So let's see how we can craft stuff to get through. And let's use some encryption techniques or some obfuscation techniques. So, the sort of the good guys have to start looking deeper and deeper and trying to figure out what exactly is being sent back in fourth year. And a lot of that has to do with who's actually sending it. Because, no surprise, in cyberspace is just like meat space. If you can find, apprehend, and prosecute bad guys, they stop being bad. And they can kind of show that crime doesn't pay and maybe people will do other stuff. So that's really good, really important. And, disrupting criminal gangs, disrupting terrorist networks, finding child pornographers, that's all good stuff. But the technology doesn't know what it's looking for. That can also be used for silencing speech, finding and rooting out dissidents, basically protecting your citizenry from those evil thoughts. And this is actually why technology alone can't solve the problem, because the technology doesn't know good and evil, and that's where policy comes in, that's where regulation comes in, because regulation is, or appropriate regulation. There's a lot of debate in this country and in this town about, all regulation is bad, all regulation is good. One of my colleagues at Georgetown did a study over a 100-year span and found that about a quarter of the time the US gets it right, only because they randomly get it right. But the point being is that some things need to be regulated, some things don't need to be. And as Milton was talking about, when you're doing the rational thing, and that rational thing is counter to public policy, that's when you need regulation to help guide the market do the right thing.
Thank you, Eric. That brings us to Micaela, who, as the sole sort of really political expert, lots been brought up this morning about the misalignment in terms of the political and technical discussion. Would love to get your thoughts on that, and really also from a sort of the policy perspective of the tension that was brought up between interoperability and local control. Would love to get the policy side of that question.
Great. Thank you very much, and just want to take a minute to say that I'm very honored to be part of such a illustrious, I think the word was, the use panel. This is a really interesting discussion, and although I feel a little out of my depth being on a technical panel, given that I feel like I know just enough to be dangerous or helpful, maybe, this is really a very interesting and important conversation. I think from a policy perspective, I really like the term that Milton introduced of misalignment, because I think that a lot of the phenomenon that we're seeing related to, related to fragmentation, I suppose, is really related to an issue related to balance of power. I think it's much more related to kind of just traditional international relations paradigms than sometimes we think about. And what we're certainly seeing is a desire by governments to figure out how, in a much more decentralized, open world, they can continue to retain some power. And I think, especially in developing countries, countries that have already felt that the balance of power has favored Western countries for too long, they tend to gravitate towards intergovernmental organizations that, as opposed to multi-stakeholder organizations that allow them to have an equal voice vis-a-vis other governments, which is really what they care most about. In the internet space, there are various phenomenon that are certainly happening, many of which have been talked about at the national level. We're seeing increasing data localization requirements. We're seeing duty of care requirements, governments imposing various types of protectionist policies both to protect incumbent industries as well as their own technology companies, a real fear of how do we compete in a global world, especially as U.S. tech companies are becoming more and more prevalent in those countries, and people are increasingly having access. Increased access equals a lot of unknowns for governments, and we're definitely seeing a lot of tension there. I think also, though, very relevant to this panel is where I see a lot of technology, a real crossroads for technology and policy really is in the standardization area. Standards, I think, are often, the less sexy part of, the way that the internet runs, but really important with respect to interoperability of technologies. And I think that I heard a lot of the panels talk about how, a lot of the internet is not necessarily at risk of fragmenting technically because the market often decides how these, which technologies are the winners. And, we heard a lot of examples, many of which that technologies that I never heard of and certainly never used, where you never, they never really came to light. They didn't work as well as others. And so the world moved on without them. What we're seeing increasingly is, back to the balance of power, we're seeing governments who both desire the ability to, participate in standardization discussions, but don't want to go to where those discussions have always been. They want to bring standardization discussions into where they like to be. And so we're seeing increasingly both international organizations, intergovernmental organizations, trying to get involved in a standardization process that has traditionally been outside the realm of governments, or mostly market-driven and industry-led, and we're seeing them try to bring it into discussions that they're more traditionally comfortable with. This is coupled with the desire at the national level to actually try to have some foresight into the kinds of technologies that are going to help them gain a competitive advantage. And I think that we see that, nowhere do we see that more than in the Internet of Things. There's a real desire to be, a lot of countries that feel like they were left behind in some way, or newer to the party, who really see an opportunity with Internet of Things to assert some leadership in what they see as a brand new technology. I'm even hearing at some meetings people talking about leapfrogging Internet to Internet of Things. And that, to many of us is kind of a funny concept, but it's a real concept to a lot of countries out there. And that is, just the kind of bad information that we're dealing with that is then leading various study groups in certain UN organizations, for example, to, rather than focus on how do we increase interoperability, which is typically the question you ask at a standardization forum, how do we increase interoperability? They're saying we need a standard for X, for smart cities, for smart homes, and the backwards process of we're concerned could actually lead to a real choking of innovation, and especially when a lot of stuff that's developed in these kinds of organizations are then taken home into countries and introduced as regulation. And we really are concerned less that the internet as we know it and as we use it here in the United States will survive. We won't necessarily be following the various standards or recommendations that are put in. But what does that mean for the 40% of the world that still remains offline? And what does that mean for countries that are really still trying to figure out how to improve their own situations and really reap the benefits economically and socially that the internet provides? And those are some of the things that we're really thinking about. Certainly, maybe during, I won't go on too far, too much longer, but there are obviously also big tensions that exist between governments that are trying to create choke points on the internet to be able to better know who is using it, both to track criminals and to go find dissidents. There are certainly tensions that exist just between how, not only how incumbent industries will be surviving, but just also how to get more people connected to the internet and what kind of an internet they should be connected to. And really, there is, you know, again, a trend that I see as very troubling is governments, but also international organizations coming in and helping and basically picking winners for the market. I see that as a big threat, both to the future of innovation as well as you know, it's both a public policy and a real technical threat.
Lots of food for that. Thanks, Micaela. I'm looking at the time. I was thinking maybe I'll ask Dr. Farber to do a quick response in the sense of, so when the internet was designed at the beginning, how many, you know, did you expect this misalignment, you know, this sort of pull more towards a centralized, you know, discussion in terms of the innovation of technology?
That was always an ongoing battle. You know, it materialized itself probably most dramatically in my mind in the OSI versus IP debate, war, fight, as both our government and the foreign governments sort of got their signals mixed, and there was a choice between going down a path which was dictated by fairly rigid standards-making bodies as opposed to the more show-us-of-works attitude of the IETF. That was a critical point, and I think there was a lesson to be had there, that you can standardize yourself all over the place, but unless you have something that actually works, you tend to standardize yourself too often into a box. And I think that's something we really have to worry about with things like the Internet of Things, which I consider a blessing on one hand and an absolute catastrophe on the other.
So thank you. I you know, knowing that the world certainly was divided between the TCP IP stack and the ISO stack, you know, many years ago, and TCP IP won out in that particular discussion, and to the point that many of you have made, which is really market convergence and market, you know, really driving the needs. I'm hoping that's an optimistic trend. On that optimistic note, I'll turn it over and ask the audience, you know, to join us in questions.
You didn't sound too optimistic.
I'm not.
I'm trying to be, you know, sort of the traditional, you know.
That was sorry. Mike got in the way again.
Mike Nelson with Cloudflare. I want to pick up on something that Eliot said that is really important, because we hear this phrase, internet fragmentation, and there isn't an understanding that we're really talking about the network and we're talking about the applications on top. And there tends to be some confusion there. My question is, I think we've got a lot of reasons not to see fragmentation of the network layer. And Milton pointed out Metcalfe's law and the fact that everybody wants to get connected to everybody else. There seems to be less economic force opposing fragmentation at the higher levels. And in particular, we're seeing a lot of discussion about regional clouds with different policies for different nations. Is there any way we can reformulate the discussion? Do we need a Farber's law or a Mueller's law that somehow will enlighten people as to why global cloud services are a good idea and get politicians to think twice before proposing these regional answers to policy problems?
Let me just throw...
Or Berger's law, maybe, or Micaela's law, or Suzanne's law.
Let me just something Bob and I were discussing last night. One of the funny types of application fragmentation that's going on now is Netflix. You know, I can watch movies in the U.S., but in fact, when I try to watch them in Europe, depends on where I am in Europe, whether I can even get near it. In most cases, you can't. that I think is going to happen more and more. Now that you could argue, as Bob says, is rational economic response for networks, but from a user's perspective, it's fragmenting the data, because movies are data that way. Our laws were never built really to take care of things that are quite as international as we'd have to face now. Our criminal laws are certainly not. And that's something which, unfortunately, technology can't help very much.
I would say that that's exactly what I'm advocating, is that we oppose alignment, that we say this is a bad thing, that the basic unit of decision-making should be the autonomous system or the platform, and we need to adjust our global institutions to, insofar as public regulation, public law is needed, we need to adjust it and innovate our institutional framework to adapt to that. So we need more globalized or transnational institutions, which, the RIRs or ICANN are good examples of. Not that you can easily translate the ICANN model into these other areas. I don't want to get into that fallacy, but the point is those are new institutions working on a global level that avoid alignment. And I think the most disappointing aspect of this whole debate is the way that Europe has fallen into the alignment pattern. Because in most sort of issues about internet freedom and human rights, Europe is going to be with us. The US and Europe are going to be together, accounting for about half of the world's GDP and maybe 2/3 of the market. But when Europe decides that they're going to have content quotas on web video, when they decide they're going to have either try to extraterritorially extend a right to be forgotten or else try to enforce it in their own jurisdiction, we have a problem. We really have to get the Europeans to realize how retrograde and unproductive this is.
Yeah, sure. I think one of the areas where we could, in fact, do a better job is being able to talk more clearly about the cost of some of these decisions, not only in terms of the money to deploy one set of choices over another, but every technology choice, certainly going back to what Eliot and Micaela were saying about standards and standardization, every set of choices there promotes certain outcomes, allows certain outcomes, and forbids certain outcomes. And what I think is happening with some of the situations you're talking about is that people aren't looking at, they make these decisions that then disable things that would be beneficial to them, that forbid outcomes that actually, if they were able to step back and formulate, would be things that they'd want, economically, socially, politically, however, along all of those elements. And that's actually something I think we could be better at, is exposing that there are costs to these choices, and they're not always what they appear to be, and they're not always what people will want to pay.
Well, part of the costs there, though, we as a society have decided that we want to enforce intellectual property laws. We, in our Constitution, we say this is our vehicle for encouraging people to create intellectual property. And there are other nations, of which the U.S. was one of them 200 years ago, that said intellectual property laws, that's great as long as we get to get it for free. And so if we have laws and contracts that say there are certain places that we know, the stuff's going to be gone and our rights are not going to be respected, we don't want to go there. And this is why actually it's not a panel one, get the policy people, panel two, get the technology people. Really need to get them all together so that when we make a decision that, like a country that decides to cut off 3/4 of the internet from their citizens, that they know they're going to take a hit in GDP. But they're doing it with their eyes open, saying, yes, but we value these other things higher, as opposed to what's going on today, which is just, oh, that stuff's bad, so we're going to block it, and not realize that they're cutting off opportunity as well.
That may be a little naive, just a little bit. It's not clear the Chinese in particular don't understand exactly what the cost balance is. They're not, to put it mildly, they're not silly people.
Right.
I'm thinking more along the lines of mandated encryption schemes and data snooping, things that are actually more
Well,
here.
from our point of view,
Right.
from their point of view, it may be a very profitable thing for them. It's very difficult to understand.
Just to add one point to what Dave said, I would point out that China's firewall is a very expensive thing to run. It's not like any developing country can devote that sort of resources to it. It's very difficult for countries to replicate that. So I think we have a tendency to point to China and say, oh my goodness, look at that. And anybody, thinking that anybody could do it. And I think probably there are 4 or 5 countries in the world that could do it if they wanted to do it. But more than that, I'm not so sure. It's a very difficult prospect because you essentially have to funnel all your connections into a handful of places and then impose a consistent policy. You have to have constant review of the streams coming in and out to determine what you believe to be appropriate. So the nice thing about the network effect is there is this huge economic advantage to being connected. And I do think China has done this with their eyes open, but I think that a lot of other countries would think, would have a very hard time making that same decision.
I think what's really interesting is, Eric, you mentioned that this is not just a technology discussion. I mean, all of you have mentioned this, but it is also an economic discussion. And I know that the State Department, for example, has been trying to expand this conversation to make sure that the economic and some of the other costs of these decisions are more aware. And I think part of the question and part of the conversation is always, well, who is it that we're trying to, who can be influenced? Let me ask the question that way. China is often brought up and the Great Firewall. Even if all the facts are on the table, and I think this is where the OECD is trying to do a good job in terms of quantifying some of these evidence, who can we actually practically influence, with these conversations? And maybe I can ask Micaela to address that.
Sure. I think so. I think that we see especially even within governments themselves, a real disconnect often between the sort of the technical staff and the policymakers. And I think oftentimes in our, even in our bilateral discussions, we'll go to a country and have really great conversations at the more technical level. There's a lot of people with a lot of skills. Oftentimes we think that the problem is just bad information or misunderstanding, but oftentimes that's present. There are really good people that are present within the country, but it's just a matter of getting the information up the chain and having the policymakers really be able to truly understand it. That becomes the issue. And so I think that in terms of influencing and changing the way that the direction this goes, I think particularly in emerging economies and particularly in Asia and in Latin America, the biggest challenge that we have, or the biggest opportunity that we have, is really trying to bridge the policy and the technical. It's why at the State Department we try to take a whole of government approach to a lot of our ICT bilaterals or our cyber dialogues, to try to bring all the various parts of the government together. Oftentimes, it's the same in the U.S. government. The right hand doesn't always talk to the left hand, and it's very good when you get, I guess, all the hands in the same room and actually have a conversation. I think another opportunity, although that we see, although I think that there really is a whole spectrum internationally about where people are on various issues. At the UN, for example, it often just comes down to a very bipolar two choices kind of debate. Either you are for openness or closeness. Either you are either for human rights or you're against human rights. And so far, unfortunately, that divide has really been, you know, the global north and the global south, or the people who have internet and the people who don't have internet. That's what we've really seen over the past several years. What's interesting about some of the cases that have come up in Europe, for example, even in some Asian countries, is that the rhetoric and the desire to just have, you know, different kinds of regulations or just security concerns, privacy concerns, concerns over the U.S.'s First Amendment, it often countries that, you know, would choose openness any day of the week end up becoming more sympathetic to certain ideas of the other side that kind of brings people who were traditionally very far left more towards the middle. And unfortunately, in global debates or consensus, or debates where you need to hit consensus, that brings the conversation, you know, in kind of a scary direction for the United States that always tries to be kind of on the left side. And I think that there would be an opportunity to have more nuance in these debates, and I think I see an opportunity. I see these issues evolving for a very long time. I think that the question really has been around, you know, internet governance, who gets to control the internet, and now you're seeing a much more breaking apart of issues, which has its advantages and disadvantages. You see a proliferation of venues that are talking about these things. You see various new industries as well as new parts of government that are getting more involved. And I think that as far as influencing or really making a difference, that's, I think, going to create a lot of challenges, but I think it will also help to be able to even just decentralize the discussion a little bit and make it a little bit less about those two poles, which I think has led to a less than healthy debate.
Micaela, can I just add on that point? I think one of the challenges there is also to recognize some of the legitimate concerns that a number of governments have, a number of developing countries are going to be facing, and some problems that we know are coming down the line. Obviously, we work closely on cybersecurity for developing countries. And, you know, so for instance, one of the problems that we know we're going to have coming down the line is the idea that as technology uses, as people use devices that end up in a developing country, eventually they become imported and their cybersecurity becomes a question. I'm not going to try and answer that here today, but I want to say that that's an example of a very legitimate concern that does need to be addressed. And so there's a certain distrust sometimes between different parties in debate, and we have to find, one of the things I think we always have to look for is the opportunity for agreement. And that's something that I think was challenging, very challenging 4 years ago. And this year I think there's an opportunity to have opportunities to find those points of agreement.
Great, thank you.
Oh, hi. Thank you. Great panel. I'm William Michael Cunningham, Creative Investment Research. A couple of things. I want to talk about internet fragmentation and the IANA name transition, whether it helps or hurts, and also the FCC decision from the appeals court yesterday and the impact that that might have on internet fragmentation. Before I do that, let me place this in context. So I created my first website November 16th, 1995. You got to remember, the internet has done a fantastic job. It worked. It did exactly what it was supposed to do. The social return from this technology being diversified was so great that we knew it was going to add to human life. It was going to make life easier for everybody. You know, what we didn't get back in 1995 was the negative impact of the commercialization. Because you got to remember, back in 1995, nobody was thinking about making money off of this thing. At least certainly I wasn't. You know, so that seems to have come in and kind of added a different dimension to the picture, kind of wrecked things. My last point is this. If you look at the 3.5 billion people who are not connected to the internet right now, most of them are brown and black. But there's nobody on the panel who kind of represents that population as you look at going forward. I would kind of suggest that you factor that in. So let me come back to the start. IANA name transition and FCC decision, impact on fragmentation.
Let me just deal with the IANA transition. Am I, no, I might.
Suzanne.
Okay.
Oh, and Eliot as well.
So the IANA transition, if we're talking about alignment, I think the IANA transition is an extremely positive development that in effect says to the world, these critical resources, which are absolutely vital to the global connectivity of the internet, particularly domain name space, is not going to be run by governments or part of a governmental defined system. It's going to be completely turned over to, people call it the global multi-stakeholder community. I think this is a much more profound change. It's really a kind of the equivalent of popular sovereignty was in the democratic revolutions of the 18th and 19th century. You're saying, you know, even conservatives in the United States were very skeptical of this concept of the global multi-stakeholder community. Who is that? Why should they have any rights to define this? And those are the same questions that the early Democrats got about the people. And it's like, who are they? You know, the sovereign relies on the king. That's a person. We know who he is. And of course, it was a he most of the time. So who are the people? Who do they represent? How do we represent them? And we have to create new institutions that actually represent internet users. And so I think the IANA transition is a very good development for this issue of alignment. I'll leave the net neutrality issue to somebody else.
Sure. No, if we get into net neutrality, we could spend the next 3 hours here.
Well, and anyway, it's going to the Supreme Court, so.
Yeah, we'll go
hasn't
to-
heard,
And can I raise another issue? Oh, I'm sorry, Eliot?
Suzanne had some.
Yeah, I was just going to add on the IANA transition, from a technical perspective, the IANA transition will have no impact except for the following, which is that it should be possible to respond faster in circumstances that require it. As Andrew Sullivan, the chair of the IAB, said in front of Congress, there was an incident involving Turkey in which they were being attacked with a denial of service attack. And it was not possible for the IANA to make changes fast enough because they couldn't get the government approval in a timely manner. Making it possible to remove one layer, if you will, of that particular level of change would have fed the protection of Turkey. So, but at a technical level, that speed is important. We want to move at internet speed. So I view the IANA transition as positive from a technical perspective, but from a fragmentation perspective, I think Milton has it right. That's a political point and not a technical point, but I think from a political standpoint, there is reason for many countries to be very confident in the mechanisms that have been put in place and are being put in place.
Yeah, I would add only from the operational perspective, IANA is really important, but it's one of many, many moving parts in keeping the internet functioning. It exists to centralize a very specific set of functions that work better if they're handled in one place. It will continue to do that. So I'm going to agree that the impact on fragmentation specifically, I don't see any. I do think that having, in terms of the operational internet, the transition represents no change at all, and that's a good thing, and that's a tremendously useful thing.
Yeah.
Dave, you
Well, sorry, you had some comments.
Are you allowed to?
Yeah, I think it's probably better that I leave some of the talk about the IANA transition to others.
I was just going to raise a node point, which maybe is controversial, too controversial to take up here, but I'm going to raise it anyway. The American Association for Arts and Sciences held a little meeting in Chicago a couple of years ago. And one of the topics was, it was on dual-use technology, and one of the dual-use technologies is the internet. And one of the studies that was presented was talking about, well, what happens if we're attacked? If the U.S. is attacked by a major cyber attack, what should we do? And the story went something like this. Well, obviously it came from China, right? Okay, so what do? We should remove them from the DNS, whatever the hell that meant. Then if that doesn't work, we should disconnect them from the internet, whatever the heck that meant. And then if that doesn't work, we should use kinetic response, which I think means throw nasty things at them, which you don't do with nuclear powers, but forget that. But that lack of understanding, these suggestions came from policy people who should know better. And just a lack of understanding between what the technology can actually do, like attribute to actually who it came from, and not just what geographic area maybe, but in fact, where did that activity really exist? Was a bunch of renegades, or was it a government effect? And what are the reasonable responses could end up with some very serious future fragmentation, not just logical fragmentation, but physical fragmentation. And that things like that are worrisome. And we don't seem to have mechanisms for dealing with those issues.
Well, I would offer, though, in my experience, I saw the opposite happening, which is, we had a forum at Georgetown on, what do we do under cyber attack? And the technologists were, oh, well, if they do a denial of service, we can, denial of service them back. And if they're cutting us off, we can cut them off back. And it was actually the policy people who reminded us that the United States has a whole spectrum of options, ranging from these tit-for-tat technical options to, bless you, to purposely ignoring, to we have the largest military in the world. We can use it, or we can threaten to use it. And that, just because something comes this way, that doesn't mean we necessarily have to respond. And that was kind of mind-opening for the technologists there, that they didn't have to, it kind of created new options and opportunities.
I have to say, I'm reminded when we were attacked by ourselves, actually, the Robert Morris worm back in, I think it was 1990, where we had a bug in a mail program that essentially took out the email infrastructure on the internet for a day or so. And we had quite interesting responses from some quarters where they were taking hatchets to their internet connections. Literally, they were breaking the cables so that they could be protected from getting the worm, and then they couldn't communicate with anyone. So the point being that having some understanding of a rational response starts with what is actually happening, having situational awareness, and then having a consultation as to that sort of broad response that Eric just mentioned.
Yeah.
Thank you. That sounds like a great topic for a future conversation. Judith?
Yes, Judith Hellerstein, many different hats, Hellerstein Associates, ISAC DC, ICANN at large. So my question goes back to what Dave Farber was talking about and a little bit what Eric was talking about on fragmentation of the internet. And you talked about your story about Netflix and not being able to watch overseas. And I'm wondering, wasn't there some type of fragmenting earlier where it seems like Apple and is using its iTunes were the only people who were able to have users have the same experience. And so when they are abroad, if they're a U.S. resident, they can watch whatever is on their iTunes. If they have movies, if they have books, if they have that. Whereas it seems like all the other companies, Netflix and all that, do not allow. And so is one person fragmenting or one person using a different network and finding other solutions so that they don't fragment the experience and, looking at other issues and how is that, I was interested in how that played out in your
You know, my first reaction is companies dig their own graves or create their own things, and Apple took, I think, a very good stand. I'm not sure the others are, in particular. You know, some of these stories, by the way, I'll just jam another point in here. Some of the stories about, for instance, the Great Wall of China, et cetera, your comment about the cost of doing it, I think is very interesting, because many years ago, the Singapore government wanted to do exactly the same thing, right? They wanted to protect their citizens, whatever that meant. And I know I and others went over there and pointed out to them that first, it wasn't going to work without a major resource. And they eventually backed down because they didn't have that type of resource. But this is not an old idea. We may see it someday in this country. Heaven forfend, but, you know, election forfend. But, you know, there's a tendency of governments to do this. And there's a tendency of the technologists not to like it happening.
I could address the the Netflix question. I think we're talking about geo-blocking, right?
Yeah.
Where you cannot see things. And this is all about copyright. And you might think, okay, it's legitimate for copyright owners to contractually limit the distribution of their material. But on the other hand, the market areas are defined somewhat arbitrarily by and anachronistically by state boundaries. And you have different copyright laws. And for example, in Germany, you have a very strong copyright association, which is extremely restrictive in terms of imposing certain kinds of geo-blocking in France and some other Europeans. And I think, and I actually hope, that we're going to see the dissolution of these state-based copyright protections, and you will see more of a globalization of the market. And I think Netflix is kind of trying to pioneer that. For a while, it looked like they were really making progress, having a globalized distribution. Now states are fighting back. So again, to me, it's all about this alignment between or misalignment between the global potential of the internet and its distribution and the imposition of borders and territories by states.
And, you know, we talk of the internet as this cloud that's out there and it's global and you can reach anywhere. It's a bunch of boxes made out of steel and aluminum that are in buildings, that are in countries, that are connected to each other with glass cables or copper cables or spectrum that's doled out by governments. These things are actually in places. And then when we kind of get on our high American horse and say, look at all the benefits of the cloud, look at how you don't need all this infrastructure, you can share all this infrastructure, isn't that great? And then we compare Estonia and Ukraine. One country has its own infrastructure, which didn't quite make sense because it wasn't really economically sensible for them to do it. It was a country of 1.4 million people, a little smaller than New Hampshire, but close to home terms. And Ukraine, a much larger country, but hey, you know, they've got all this cloud stuff, and they're getting services from their nice neighbor, the Russian Federation. Which is, again, sensible, and wow, isn't that the whole, you know, we're all one big happy family except for when we're not. And then in retrospect, instead of going, wow, look at the smart Ukrainians, they're not going to replicate that, mandate stuff in country, have their own connections, and now we've turned around, oh, look at how smart the Estonians were to, this internet is a physical thing, or it's instantiated by physical things. We like to have it as open as we can. We like to have people have the options, but there may be times where, you know, governments at the behest of their people or against their people, it doesn't know good or evil, you know, may be compelled to do things.
So I'm going to ask, looking at the time and being respectful of the time of your time as well as the audience, I'm going to ask you know, for your closing remarks. And in the closing remarks, and Micaela will give it the floor to you next, is can you, going back to the you know, so what do we do next, right? What are some of the practical steps that we can take as a community to address the misalignment, to leverage some of the nuances that you're seeing emerge in the global policy discussion. I would love your thoughts on that. Sure. And we'll start with Micaela.
Well, so I think, although I think we've talked in some less than optimistic terms, I think that there is a lot of there's a lot of opportunity, a lot of reason to be optimistic about what comes next. What I was going to add to the last part of the discussion, which I'll bring in here, is I think there's a real tendency to think about a lot of the challenges that we're experiencing on the internet as something that's brand new, when in fact a lot of the public policy challenges related to safety, related to copyright, taxation, are issues that we've been dealing with for quite some time. It's just now we have a new platform that we're dealing with them on. And so I think that looking ahead, the more that there's a tendency to try to bring in all of these issues to where the ICT people are, but the more that we can try to address some of these issues in those traditional venues that actually deal with human rights and crime and figure out how we can bridge some of those gaps, I think is going to be a real opportunity. And I think the other important looking ahead kind of item really goes back to a comment that Eliot made before, is addressing legitimate concerns, assisting countries with improving their capacity to address cybersecurity threats, and connecting the unconnected is really important. There's a lot of people out there that don't have access to the internet, and really our best defense against bad information, our best defense against just increased fragmentation, I really do believe is getting more people online, more people who are able to participate, truly understand the technology, and participate in the debates and the discussions. I think that's really how we're going to be able to move forward as a global community, more so than any single fix.
Thank you, Micaela. Eliot?
Thanks so much, Carolyn, and thanks again for having me remotely there. I think the parting comment I would just make is that there are a number of these collaborative issues that we will have to address. And just as layer 3 has to a great extent ossified and we're attempting to transition from one IP to another, so too much the structures that we have today, they need to be able to evolve as well. We have international organizations that were set up for the world of the 1940s, attempting to make standards for the world of this century and this decade. And we have partitions within the international framework that are very difficult to change. This is a very difficult problem. And so one of the questions that I think we have to set ourselves to is how do we evolve those institutions so that they can be responsive to the needs not only of developing countries and their societies, but of the world as a whole. And how do we address the fragmentation amongst those mechanisms? I think that's the next step in terms of a policy discussion that I would like to see. Thank you.
Just minor reform of international institutions. Eric?
Yeah, so also on a more upbeat note, we talk about fragmentation. The most in the news obvious place is the DNS. And the cheerful note there is if countries, individuals wanted to fragment, from a technology perspective, they can do it overnight. The ICANN works on a handshake and an agreement. And actually, for all this talk, and by the way, it's our government as well, or some people in our government are talking about, why are we going to give away the internet? It's actually been working pretty well, and that kind of gives some hope, I think, for the future and the future of the multi-stakeholder process.
Thank you for your optimism. Suzanne?
Sure. First of all, thank you very much for having me here. I've actually learned quite a lot listening to all of the conversation here. This is great. But I'm realizing I'm also in the cautiously optimistic camp. I think in terms of moving forward, we need more dialogue of this kind. There's a distinction that some of us have been using in some of these conversations that might be helpful. As far as, I want to support particularly Micaela's point and Eliot's, that a great deal of what we're dealing with here is public policy issues and institutions that have been around for a long time and ways of looking at things that are not unique to the internet. We have this tendency to act as if the challenges we have with the internet are new, and of course they're not. But there's a distinction that has been of some interest that my friend George Sadowski phrases as the difference between governance or institutionalization or these structures on the internet and of the internet. Where if you're talking about content, if you're talking about the things people are doing with the internet, that is probably, that's traditional public policy. There's a lens there that people are familiar with, and I think we shouldn't shy away from applying. There's a different set of challenges that sometimes need a different look when we're talking about how do we build the common infrastructure that allows us to have a single internet to apply our different policies over and so on and so forth. And I think sometimes being able to talk about those things as distinct would help us with some of the areas where we can get, if nothing else, confused by the great wealth of options available to us. And having some respect for that distinction might actually help us through some of the challenges.
Very good suggestion. Thank you, Suzanne. Milton?
Yeah, so pragmatic policy options, it's very challenging, it's easy to say we ought to do this, but to come up with pragmatic options is difficult. So in thinking about that, one thing that comes to my mind, which I'm not very optimistic about, is trade agreements, in the sense that what we're talking about in terms of the unobstructed flow of information and the offering of services is really exactly what economic trade agreements are supposed to be about. However, it's with both of our major presidential candidates basically being opposed to free trade these days, the Republican Party turning its back on free market, and the rest of the world not being, that congenial, I think, these days to free trade. I'm not sure how far that gets you. So I think one of the key pragmatic things is that we need to strengthen and promote these private sector-based globalized institutions, particularly in the standardization area, that we need to make sure that standards are formed through bottom-up consensus and not through top-down imposition on a global basis. I think the Internet Society actually has a very important role to play in promoting the idea of non-alignment, of globalization, of global capabilities in developing countries and the rest of the world, so that there's more of a constituency for this in these countries that are resisting it. I think cloud providers need to be more aggressive about resisting alignment and perhaps enlisting support. And in terms of foreign policy, I think the State Department, maybe needs to decide, I'm not sure I advocate this, but think about this circumvention issue where we are actively promoting technologies and capabilities that undermine censorship. This is a kind of a dangerous thing in some ways. It certainly conflicts with traditional notions of sovereignty, but then Hillary Clinton has been promoting it since 2010, and the State Department has been funding these technologies. So what are we really doing there? Do we really know what we're doing? Is it really consistent? And do we want to think of more effective ways to do that?
Dave, we'll give you the last word.
Yeah, I've learned a lot too from this discussion. I'm still going to home back to the fact that if we continue to just evolve what we have, there's no sign that will converge to the type of trusted, securable systems that we're going to need in the future. As we get more and more, as the internet technology becomes more and more dominant in our basic infrastructure, our electricity, power, every place, it becomes much more critical that we understand how to keep that from failing and how to keep it from being subverted. And I think we need to pay a lot more attention to that. And I'm not sure that we can just trivially evolve what we have. No, when I characterized it in California, I said it was like walking on 7 layers of ice with water in between, everything's shifting because nothing was really designed to be trusted and secured. And I think we have to pay attention to that. At the same time, we do what we can with the current world to keep it from busting apart. And I think there's some real danger of it busting apart. I reference you to one interesting paper, which was actually about 3 years ago up at West Point. There was a meeting, West Point hosts annual meetings, and it was on cybercrime and cybersecurity. A very interesting paper because it just outlined, in fact, all the threat, international threats that are targeted at disrupting our infrastructure for a whole set of reasons, some commercially, some tactically. And I think we have to pay much more attention to that. Otherwise, we will end up with a fragmented world in self-protection, if nothing else. We could also do without a few more, I won't mention, forget it.
You can't leave us hanging.
Well, you have to take this correctly. I'm not criticizing what he did as much as what's happened as a result of it. We need considerably less Snowdens, because that triggered a lot of the desire to insulate, to split apart, to protect themselves. I won't debate whether what he did was right or wrong, but it would be nice if big surprises like that didn't happen, because it will cause governments to react badly, and it certainly did cause them to react.
Great. Thank you, Dave, and thank you all of our panelists for a really great discussion. The takeaway really is, trust and securable internet ecosystem is going to be key to this conversation. And there are a few, sort of minor challenges like reforming the international institutions, negotiating trade agreements, building capacity. But I've learned a lot, and all of your advice and insights are greatly appreciated. And thank you to the audience for staying with us. Dave, any? And special thanks to Pepper, because he wasn't in the room when I thanked him this morning.
Thank you.
No, no.